So it seems a little strange, I think, maybe that How to Be Famous is the title of a sermon based on this text. Like, this text doesn't really seem to be about famous. Consider the lilies of the field, learn from the flowers. Why worry about what you wear or what you eat? Why worry about these things in life? But I think famous is nonetheless an experience that is pretty common for us, this desire, this urge. If it's not common for us individually, and here it's certainly an American cultural phenomenon, one that's becoming more and more prevalent. Now, I think as kids, this idea of wanting to be somebody is always prevalent. It's just a natural sort of part of our existence. When I was a kid, I wanted what every boy wanted to be. I wanted to grow up and be a famous ukulele player. Who's with me? But as I got older, of course, those things sort of move on, and you start thinking realistically about what it is your life is called to be or who you're supposed to be. But nonetheless, you still sort of see fame the way in which we've always sort of looked up to certain legendary characters or mythical people, and the way that in Europe people looked up to the nobility and royalty around them, the way that in ancient cultures they looked up to the mythic heroes, the way that we do today, looking up to movie stars and to athletes and celebrities. It's a part of our culture. Linda and I did have a brief brush with fame back when we first got married. In 1980, my wife and I went to Belize. It had just been Belize for only about 6 years or so. A film that was a complete flop. I don't know if any of you ever saw it, but it was called Dogs of War. Anyone ever see that movie? Who saw it? One person? Yeah. And it starred Christopher Walken, and it was directed by John Irvin, and It wasn't a great movie, but it was filmed in Belize, and it just happened to be filmed on the week and a half or so that Linda and I had decided. We got married in 1978, and we decided to have one of our big honeymoons, because we never took a really big honeymoon. We decided to do it in Belize. And I had some family living there, and they were staying, Christopher Walken and a number of the actors and John Irving were staying in the very hotel we were staying in, which was one of the 3 small hotels on the island of San Pedro in Belize at the time. And, of course, it was exciting to be around these movie stars and Christopher Walken, a very young Christopher Walken at that. We didn't get to brush too much with them there. We saw them doing some of the filming, and we watched them come and go. And at dinner time, we would sit at one table, and all of those folks at another table, and then they ate in different places on the island as well. But it was at the airport on our way back that we had our fateful encounter with them. The airport in those days was a small third world airport, as you can imagine, kind of a stucco structure with 2 stories, every window open, ceiling fans, no air conditioning, hot, humid, overcrowded because every single flight was leaving at the same time. So they were all of us waiting for our flights with no room to sit or stand around in. We were just on top of each other. And Linda had eaten some bad fish that night before. Or at least that's what we're assuming. But she was on the floor, and I was on the floor next to her, holding her poor, pitiful arm and trying to kind of keep her focused. She could not get up to the bathroom. Christopher Walken was standing right in front of her. His co-actress was standing next to him. It was packed. Linda, who was semi-conscious with this nausea and this feeling right now, literally was kind of grabbing hold of his pant leg and just tugging on his pants the way that maybe a small child would tug. She had no desperation. She literally was just pitifully hanging on and every now and then he would look down, somewhat in disgust, as if in one of those terrible images of someone looking at a third world person and going, "Move away, you're disgusting." And Linda didn't even look up. She was just like clinging to his pant leg, and he wasn't moving. There was nowhere for him to go, honestly. And well, you know what happened. She did. She threw up right on Christopher Walken's shoes. And I wish I could imitate him, because he looked down and he went, "Oh, God." And he just rolled his eyes. And poor Linda, I mean, she couldn't move anywhere. She was just kind of stuck there, and I kind of pushed through some people, and somebody must have seen something because a towel appeared. And so we tried to clean things up, but there was nowhere to go. He just stood there and watched. And so after it was all over with and the airport started to clear a little bit and people started moving to their flights, Linda was feeling a little better. About half an hour or so had passed. I got her some 7-Up by the time people started moving. But as we watched Christopher get in line, there's no first class. I don't know if you've ever flown to Belize. Nowadays, everybody goes there. But in those days, it was TACA Airlines, TACA, which was the primary Belizean Central American airline, which we all called Take a Chance Airline. There were no first class seats. It was just sort of like Southwest. It was just sort of like a big cattle car, and you sat there and you just kind of crowded in. So they did get first chance to sit where they wanted to, and Christopher Walken tried to sit in a place that was somewhat isolated towards the front. And his co-stars had already sat down in other places, and we walked past, and Christopher looked up as the most stereotypical tourist couple you've ever seen in your life. The plaid short sleeve shirt with the big round straw hat, and she was wearing a bright multicolored shirt with shorts and a big hat with a flower on it. And she said, "Oh, look, Henry, it's Christopher Walken." And you could see him look up as though he was saying, "I've just gone to hell." And literally, as Linda and I were passing by, because he did know who we were. I mean, they were at the same hotel, and we knew family and whatnot there. And he literally looked up at this point, longingly, pitifully looked at Linda, who was kind of close by, and just leaned back in sort of a plea. And Linda quickly scooted in between the couple and sat down next to Christopher Walken, who smiled and said, again, I wish I could imitate his voice, "Are you feeling better?" She said that after the flight took off and that they had a wonderful time conversing, and he was incredibly apologetic for not being able to get out of the way, and he completely understood the whole situation. They had a wonderful time, and that couple, of course, was not able to get in there, which again spared him quite a bit of misery, I'm sure. But my brush with fame came years later when I started touring around as a storyteller, and I made my first couple of visits in a school system down in Houston, and I had walked into this school, and this older librarian had said she was so excited about me being there and couldn't wait to see all of my books, and was so proud of all of my achievements with Caldecott award-winning awards for all of the picture books that I had done. And she said, "Gerald, we have been looking forward to your being here." Well, I wasn't sure exactly what she was talking about until I got into the morning and realized that she thought I was the 5-time Caldecott Award-winning Gerald McDermott, who was also a good friend with Joseph Campbell, a mythologist himself, who is in the Campbell Library there, died a few years ago, very well known as a children's author. She thought I was Gerald McDermott. And she was so ecstatic. And as one performance went after another, I thought, I don't have the heart to tell her. She got for one thing, I have no idea how she could make that mistake. But the second thing I didn't have the heart to tell her was because I needed the money. And so for a day, I was Gerald McDermott. And everyone treated me with this amazing sort of royalty and fanfare. And I never did tell them. And I don't know if she probably figured it out, but she didn't have the heart to admit to making that kind of a mistake. The desire for recognition is something that's deep, and it's in everyone, I think. Again, as children, it's natural. But Carl Jung said that the modern civilization, one of the most unique facets about the modern civilization is its neuroses. Unlike anything before it, any generation before it, and what he felt was going to be a continued diving into a spiraling of this kind of neuroses. And he said it was based, basically, in this one desire for recognition. That was the cause for so many of our neuroses. And I think what he meant basically was that our desire to be connected is profound. Nowadays, it's even more so. If Carl Jung were around, I can't imagine what he'd be thinking with the accessibility of the internet and the availability with your 50 seconds of fame or your 3 minutes of fame with any number of options on the internet. So I started looking up this idea of fame and what it means. And then it struck me as odd. And it's somewhat obvious, but I wonder sometimes if we realize how obvious it is. You know, we say that our culture is addicted, but in a lot of ways, I don't think we recognize it's also vastly codependent. And we all play an enormous role in that addiction. The very fact of that, you just have to walk to a grocery line and see people plastered across the latest magazines, the latest stars to try to get your attention. And we feed off of it. And again, I speak in general terms, but as people in the Western world, we feed off of this kind of recognition, whether it's ours or whether it's vicarious. In a lot of ways, we are feeding into the very addiction that is at the heart of some of our greatest problems. So I looked up the word fame. It comes from Greek, and it actually has the same root word as fabulous or fable. The same root word which means to tell a story about or to talk about. So this notion of fame is that it is not necessarily the truth, it's rumor. And yet everybody wants it. Isn't that interesting? You know, I think about this idea of reality TV and how the last couple of decades we've seen this just blossoming, this growth. What do you call it? Festula, maybe. Maybe that's a better word for it. But it's this prominence of reality TV. Now, I'm going to step on a few toes here. It started with things like The Bachelor, The Bachelorette, American Idol, Dancing with the Stars. I'm not even going to ask you to raise your hands. But I know these are popular shows. And while there are certainly there's some wonderful things that these shows bring, they also bring a bit of reality to us that makes us begin to wonder which is real, who's imitating who at this point. And so then we have this onslaught of these new ones which even hit closer to home and closer to our reality. It's like watching Jerry Springer now, but it's sanctioned and it's on every channel. So we have the Kardashians, we have Big Brother, we have Duck Dynasty. I just started, I only watched it once, but I just saw for the first time a couple of weeks ago, Dating Naked. Come on, you heard of it? You have? You heard of it? It's a real show. I'm thinking, really? Okay, well, that's not too much reality being posted there, I guess. But now there's follow-ups to it, too, now. There actually are sequels coming out for this one. There is Naked Buying, which is going to be a home buying show. I don't even know what the premise is on this one. And then there's Naked and Afraid, which is basically taking Survivor, only now you just put naked people in the situation. It's great. You know, with all of these shows, it was interesting as I started looking at this whole idea of what Carl Jung had said about this basic neurosis that we suffer from, and yet that is what drives so much of our media. It's no wonder that we're an addictive culture. It's who we are at our very core, and it's what all of the media and others in enterprises and corporations feed off of. So then I saw this one article that came out it came out from this online newspaper called The Daily Caller. You can look it up. It came out a few weeks ago. And it was particularly talking about America's toxic culture of fame. But it was bringing up one in particular show that really sort of hit too close to home, and they canceled it. It was being shown, TMZ had put this thing together. And some of the same people that did The Bachelor and then produced that were on the team for this one. And it was called Famous in 12 Weeks. Did anybody see it? Anybody watch it at all? It didn't last. It only ran for apparently 2 or 3 episodes. But it was about a family that they plucked up. And it was sort of modeled after an earlier Fox series that came out that was also canceled that was called H.A.R., Hater. And the premise of that show is that they brought on people and then who criticized certain reality TV stars for their shallowness. And then those reality TV stars were then brought onto the same set so that they had sort of this confrontation, which again is sort of just mind-boggling after a while, of reality and mimicking itself. So with this one show, famous in 12 weeks, apparently the two daughters in this family began to just go at it in one episode. And the great way that the Kardashians can go after each other. But it got more and more intense until at one point in the show, and it was the last episode, at one point in the show, one sister looked at the other sister just in deep, obvious pain and said, "You don't understand. I'm just like you. I'm just trying to figure out who I am." Now, if that doesn't just slap you in the face with the whole problem to begin with, and maybe that's what got too close to home. The writer in this article suggested that maybe the producers realized that this sort of actually lets the cat out of the bag, so to speak. If they start dealing really therapeutically with what's going on here, then they're going to lose their basis for continuing its promotion. Because again, part of its ability to succeed is our ability to not really look at what we're dealing with here. Is our tendency just to sort of live vicariously in others' darkness. So I want to tell you a quick little story. The story occurred to me as I was thinking about Psalms 139. See if it doesn't come to mind as I tell you this little story. I can't think of the mime artist that I saw. It was out in San Diego, and he had a wonderful mime company out there that was called, oh, now I'm going to forget it. He had studied with Marcel Marceau. But at any rate, I was out there actually for a storytelling workshop, and the guy stood up, and instead of miming the story like you would expect him to do, he simply told it, which baffled everyone, because now the theater was happening in our heads. A fish was once swimming in the ocean, minding its own business, enjoying the water around it. It would move one fin and then the other fin and swing its tail as it gently moved through the ocean, the waves carrying it up and down. When one day the fish looked down and suddenly noticed this chasm. It was like a dark fissure at the bottom of the sea, and it seemed to open wider and wider until it almost appeared as though this chasm was a vacuum and was about to suck the fish in. The fish began to feel a sense of panic, what the artist called finis nervosa. He could not figure out how to avoid the chasm. And so he began to bend his little fish-like body and reach with his mouth to grab his tail in order to hold himself up. But of course he couldn't reach his tail, and so all he ended up doing was swimming around in circles, chasing his own tail. Until after some time, the fish heard a voice. The ocean itself speaking out and saying, "What are you doing?" And the fish said, "I'm trying to get away from this chasm. I'm about to be sucked into this darkness, and I can't get away from this chasm. If I hold myself up, I can save myself." And the ocean said, "Well, how is it that you haven't fallen in the chasm before?" Well, it took a moment, but the fish stopped reaching for its tail and noticed that it was floating. And it said, "My fins?" The ocean said, "Well, that's curious. What would happen if you moved a fin?" And as the fish did, of course, it moved to one direction. And then as it moved its fin, it moved back to the other direction. And within just a few moments, the fish had suddenly begun swimming again. The ocean spoke and said, "Perhaps when you realize that you are who you ought to be, that you are what you ought to be, and that you have most everything you need, at that point you'll stop chasing your own end and swimming with what's before you." Psalm 139 says, "Wherever I go, you are with me. If I make my bed In the deepest darkness, you are with me. You are both night and day. As Mitzi said in her prayer when she closed her prayer and gave thanks to the one in whom we move and live and have our being, the Apostle Paul said that often that's the way we think of God. God is in and amongst and outside and all around. But how easy we forget. And it's easy for this chasm to take over. It's easy for us to get caught up in this darkness. If the week that we've experienced most recently, this week and the week before, haven't shown us anything, they have at least shown us that our world is filled with darkness. For some of us, it's been all too familiar a reminder. For some of us, that chasm is almost always looming before us, but just barely, just out of reach, perhaps. But weeks like we've experienced bring it close to home again. And it's hard sometimes in the midst of that, in the midst of people dying on Mount Sinjar, seemingly foolishly, and of a famous comedian who brought joy to everyone taking his own life, and of violence towards youth in Missouri and Ebola. There is darkness all around. So it does seem a little difficult, I think, to realize that God is indeed present in the midst of all of that. And how do we finally come to hear that voice? So I want to suggest something. And it comes from what Jesus told his disciples. And we're going to be looking at it over the next few weeks in different ways. Jesus said, listen to the flowers. Look at life around you. Go back and read the book of Job, where Job tells his friends, in the midst of all that's happened to him, and they say, where is your God now? And he says, go ask the bear. Go ask the lion. Ask the tall cedars, the Lebanon trees. Jesus says, consider the lilies. There's a wonderful book, and I want to end it with these two little stories. There's a wonderful book that I encourage you to go check out. It's called Small Graces, the gift of everyday life, the gifts of everyday life. And the guy that wrote it was Kent Newbern. Kent tells a story in there of how he went to visit a Jesuit friend who was a PhD and who had studied all of these different degrees and who had actually spent time as a chaplain for years and pondering the deep questions. Why am I here? What's my purpose? Where is God in all of this? And if so, what does God want of me? And Kent says that he would often be in awe of this priest because of his devotion to that study. And then he gave it up. He gave it all up to work a small community garden and to work with people in developing sort of creative gardens, vegetable gardens, Japanese gardens, to create these gardens in the community. So he went and visited him one time, and he said that this friend of mine, he said, he invited me over to the garden, and I asked him how it was now that he's kind of moved into this quieter life. And he leaned over to Kent, and he said, I don't stop asking the big questions. The large questions still loom every day. Every day they are still present. He said, I just don't look for big answers. I look for small answers. And then he kind of motioned for Kent to lean in, and Kent says in his story, he says, I leaned in where my friend had been making one of these Japanese gardens. He'd been cultivating this for months. And he said, he pulled back a branch, and he said, look right here. And he pulled back a branch of one of the shrubs, and right beneath it was one of those tiny little Japanese trees. And it was beautifully formed. And as he let the branch fall back, he said, now if you look in here, you'll see that just the light is coming right through there. He said, I didn't know that tree was there. He said, I didn't see it at first. It was covered by these branches. All I had to do was trim a little bit of the bush here and allow a little bit of the light in. Do whatever I could. And the plant took over. The tree, in time, leaned into the light. He looked at Kent and said, what more do I need to know about God and faith? Maybe being in this ocean together is something what Fred Rogers once referred to when his mom told him that in the midst of the tragedy he was experiencing, he didn't need to look for answers. He needed to look for the helpers. She would always say, it's a hard time, look for the helpers. They're always there. Sometimes we're the ones who are called to be the helpers. And I think maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said, I need you to be like me to one another. Maybe that's what it means to be Christ to one another. Maybe that's a little bit of what it means to be authentic, is to be more present in the ocean, to be more present in God's being, to be more present to one another, to lean in just a little bit enough that maybe for one another we reflect a little bit of that light. Maybe for our own good, we need to practice a little bit more of that ourselves and just take a moment to lean into the small things around us. Get rid of the big questions for a while and just look at the little answers that are all about us. I think that gets a little closer to what it means to be authentic. And perhaps as Naomi Shihab Nye said, that perhaps that's really what it means to be famous too. If what we're seeking in being famous is to be recognized, then perhaps all we need to do is to be us. And soon enough we will be. We will indeed be famous for the one who leaned in, for the one who listened, for the one who was there, for the one who saw the flower and saw the kingdom of God in its midst where others missed it. Maybe that's what it means to be famous, for not forgetting what we can do. Amen.